What will happen to Donald Trump if his secret police force is ruled illegal? Imagine this: a former president building what critics describe as a private army, a force of agents with lowered age requirements, slashed training, and loyalty not to the Constitution, but to him personally. For years, questions have swirled around whether Donald Trump's push to expand immigration enforcement and border patrol was less about national security and more about consolidating personal power. Now, the stakes couldn't be higher. If courts were to rule this secretive force illegal, the fallout would ripple far beyond Trump himself. It would test the very boundaries of presidential authority, expose the fragility of democratic checks and balances, and potentially reshape the political landscape heading into the next election. Would Trump face legal consequences, political humiliation, or even disqualification from future office? Or would he once again twist the narrative to his advantage? Stay tuned as we break it down right now. The issue before us is profound. What are the political, legal, and constitutional consequences if Donald Trump's so-called secret police force is officially ruled illegal? This analysis will examine the origins of the force, the constitutional precedents, the historical warnings of America's founders, and the potential consequences for Donald Trump personally, as well as for the nation's democratic institutions. The discussion requires us to focus on three dimensions simultaneously. First, the legal terrain, where courts have the power to determine the constitutionality of any federal paramilitary initiative. Second, the political arena, where public perception and congressional oversight could either limit or inflame the situation. Third, the societal implications, including how the public, civil society, and security institutions might react to the invalidation of such a force. The transcript reveals that during Trump's presidency and campaign periods, initiatives were taken to expand immigration enforcement personnel far beyond previous levels. Reports point to 10,000 new ICE agents, 3,000 Border Patrol recruits, and even efforts to lower both the recruitment age and the training requirements. The decision to cut training in half is especially significant because it suggests a deliberate strategy of speed and volume over professionalization and accountability. A legal expert like Judge Breyer has already noted this resembles a standing army operating under presidential control. Historically, the United States has sought to avoid precisely this situation, fearing a president who might wield domestic forces as instruments of political power. By invoking imagery from Nazi propaganda and white supremacist groups, the recruiting campaigns appear not merely administrative but ideological. The posters cited, with slogans such as "Defend your culture" and "Remember your heritage," are less about law enforcement and more about identity mobilization. This blurs the line between legitimate federal service and a political militia. The Constitution contains implicit and explicit protections against the misuse of federal force on domestic soil. Two key considerations stand out. First, the Posse Comitatus Act restricts the use of federal military forces in domestic law enforcement without congressional authorization. Although ICE and Border Patrol are not technically military units, the creation of a de facto standing force under presidential control treads dangerously close to that boundary. Second, the founders were explicit in the Declaration of Independence and later debates about their fear of a president commanding domestic troops without civilian oversight. Judge Breyer's 52-page decision, as cited in the transcript, emphasizes that using a federal police force for domestic occupation is unconstitutional. If courts at multiple levels confirm this judgment, then the force in question would be not just controversial, but outright illegal. That legal designation carries implications for funding, recruitment, accountability, and the president's authority itself. If Trump's paramilitary initiative is ruled illegal, several potential legal consequences follow. First, the dismantling of the program would be immediate. All contracts, recruitment pipelines, and training initiatives tied to the force would be nullified. Congress and federal agencies would be prohibited from allocating funds to sustain it. Second, Trump himself could face investigation into whether he knowingly violated federal law by ordering the creation of such a force. While a former president enjoys some political insulation, exception, legal liability can extend to actions taken outside the scope of constitutional authority. Third, civil suits could emerge. Victims of abuse or wrongful detention carried out by members of the force may argue that Trump's directives directly facilitated constitutional violations. Even if criminal liability is unlikely, civil liability could entail significant financial and reputational costs. The political consequences may in fact outweigh the legal ones. Trump's appeal has often rested on the perception of strength, decisiveness, and the willingness to challenge norms. However, if the courts rule his force illegal, it reframes the narrative from strong leadership to unconstitutional overreach. Such a ruling could provide his political opponents with a clear, judicially validated argument that Trump attempted to undermine democratic norms. Even for supporters, the idea of a court-declared illegal police force raises uncomfortable questions about governance, rule of law, and respect for constitutional limits. Moreover, this ruling would reverberate internationally. Allies and adversaries alike would see the United States grappling with a president accused of building an unlawful domestic army. This damages credibility and provides propaganda material for critics abroad. American history offers numerous warnings. The fear of a standing army under direct presidential command was not theoretical for the founders. They had seen the British monarchy deploy troops to enforce colonial subjugation. Later, episodes like the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II demonstrated how quickly domestic security measures could cross constitutional lines. Each time, courts and Congress were forced to reckon with the balance between security and liberty. The difference in Trump's case is the explicit ideological recruitment. By signaling to Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and other groups that their past affiliations were not disqualifying, the administration opened the door to a force shaped as much by ideology as by federal law. If declared illegal, the parallel would be not merely administrative mismanagement, but an unprecedented step toward authoritarian control. If Trump's paramilitary-style initiative is formally declared illegal by the courts, the effects will not stop with his own political fate. Such a ruling would reshape how the nation thinks about law enforcement and its proper boundaries for decades to come. The transcript makes clear that crime rates, particularly violent crime, have declined since the peak years of the COVID-19 pandemic. While crime is a persistent issue across both red and blue jurisdictions, the overall trend is downward. Against that backdrop, the rationale for dramatically expanding federal enforcement with a heavily militarized structure becomes tenuous. A program designed to recruit tens of thousands of lightly trained, ideologically motivated agents looks less like a public safety response and more like a political instrument. By striking it down, the courts would reinforce a long-standing principle in American governance. Public safety is best protected through robust, accountable, community-oriented policing, not through centralized federal paramilitary units. Local police departments, while imperfect, operate under municipal oversight and are subject to local political accountability. Expanding their capacity through professional training in de-escalation, cultural competency, and constitutional protections has been shown to reduce incidents of abuse while maintaining public trust. A ruling of illegality would likely redirect policy discussions and funding. Federal and state governments might prioritize grants to enhance local law enforcement training and strengthen civil rights compliance rather than purchasing military-grade equipment or rushing new recruits into underdeveloped programs. Civil liberties groups would press for oversight mechanisms ensuring that federal involvement in policing remains supplemental and not dominating. In the long run, this would mark a decisive shift away from the militarization of domestic law enforcement and toward a reaffirmation of constitutional limits. The judiciary sits at the center of this unfolding story. Judge Breyer's initial ruling against Trump's force can be understood as the first shot in what will inevitably become a larger judicial battle. The stakes are not only about Trump personally, but also about the constitutional balance of power between the executive and the other branches of government. If higher courts, including the Supreme Court, affirm the illegality of this initiative, the precedent would be historic. It would enshrine a clear constitutional barrier preventing presidents from organizing paramilitary-style forces for domestic deployment. Such a decision would echo earlier moments when the judiciary drew bright lines against executive overreach. One of the most notable examples is the 1952 Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer case, where the court blocked President Truman's attempt to seize private steel mills during the Korean War, reinforcing that even during crises, presidents cannot exceed their constitutional authority. By comparison, a ruling against Trump's force would serve as a modern equivalent, clarifying that public safety does not give presidents unlimited latitude to assemble standing domestic armies. This would strengthen democratic norms and provide a safeguard against future leaders tempted to cross similar lines. The opposite scenario, however, carries profound implications. If the Supreme Court narrows or overturns the ruling, effectively granting presidents broad authority to mobilize paramilitary units on domestic soil, it would fundamentally alter the American system of governance. It would signal that executive power is expansive enough to permit the creation of centralized forces outside the traditional civilian law enforcement framework. That outcome would destabilize the carefully maintained balance between liberty and security, inviting not only Trump but any future president to wield unprecedented domestic authority. In short, the judiciary's response will either reinforce the founding vision of checks and balances or redefine it in ways that dramatically empower the executive branch. Beyond the courts, the response of the American public and civil society will determine how the story develops. The use of Nazi-style imagery, the lowering of recruitment standards, and the embrace of extremist groups such as Proud Boys or Oath Keepers have already provoked widespread unease. If courts declare the force illegal, advocacy organizations, journalists, and grassroots movements will seize the moment to demand tighter controls. Calls for transparency in recruitment, oversight of federal agencies, and stronger congressional monitoring will gain momentum. Media coverage will frame the ruling as confirmation that Trump attempted to bypass constitutional protections. For many voters, this narrative will reinforce doubts about his fitness for leadership. At the same time, political polarization ensures a divided response. Among independent and moderate voters, the judgment may serve as a disqualifying factor, painting Trump as a leader willing to cross dangerous lines. For his most loyal supporters, however, the ruling may be interpreted not as a safeguard of democracy, but as evidence of establishment hostility. The familiar theme of the deep state persecuting Trump would be revived, deepening divisions and further entrenching partisan loyalties. Civil society groups will play a crucial role in mediating these interpretations. Legal advocacy organizations will likely use litigation and education campaigns to reinforce constitutional lessons. Grassroots movements will push for reforms that prevent recurrence. Whether these efforts succeed depends on their ability to mobilize broad public consensus in a climate where consensus is increasingly elusive. Several plausible scenarios emerge once Trump's force is formally ruled illegal. Each has different implications for his legal exposure, political standing, and the nation's institutional development. One scenario is minimal legal impact, but significant political damage. Under this outcome, the courts shut down the force without directly penalizing Trump personally. He seizes the opportunity to claim persecution, arguing that the judiciary and establishment have conspired against him. This narrative may energize his loyal base, but could alienate moderates and independents, undermining his broader electoral viability. Another scenario involves renewed investigations. The Department of Justice could revisit Trump's directives, probing whether he intended to use the force for unconstitutional ends, such as interfering with elections or suppressing dissent. Even if criminal charges do not result, the investigative process itself could occupy Trump with legal distractions and further tarnish his reputation. Civil liability presents another pathway. If inadequately trained or extremist recruits engaged in abuses, wrongful detentions, civil rights violations, or violent acts, victims could file lawsuits. Plaintiffs would argue that Trump's directives created the conditions for these harms. Lengthy civil proceedings could impose financial costs, consume political capital, and extend the controversy long after the force is dismantled. Finally, the ruling could inspire constitutional reform momentum. Lawmakers from both parties, though divided on many issues, may find common ground in reinforcing civilian control over federal enforcement. Legislative proposals could include stricter recruitment standards, transparency requirements, or explicit statutory prohibitions against presidents organizing paramilitary units. If enacted, these reforms would ensure that the episode serves as a turning point, closing loopholes and strengthening the constitutional order for the future. A U.S. president being associated with an illegal domestic paramilitary force has international consequences. Allies may question America's commitment to democratic norms. For nations already skeptical of U.S. democracy promotion, this becomes a case study in hypocrisy. Adversaries could exploit the situation. Authoritarian states may point to Trump's actions as proof that America too struggles with autocracy. Disinformation campaigns could further inflame divisions. On the other hand, a firm judicial rejection of the force could reassure allies that American institutions remain resilient. By dismantling an unconstitutional initiative, the courts would demonstrate the strength of the U.S. constitutional order. The broader implication is about resilience. If Trump's force is struck down, it would mark a reaffirmation of constitutional checks and balances. It would show that institutions can withstand attempts at overreach even by a president. However, the fact that such a force could be assembled in the first place raises alarms. It demonstrates vulnerabilities in recruitment oversight, federal funding allocations, and public vigilance. Going forward, the nation will need to confront questions about how to safeguard against similar attempts. That may include stricter congressional oversight of DHS and ICE, enhanced whistleblower protections, and more transparent reporting on recruitment and training standards. What will happen to Donald Trump if his secret police force is ruled illegal? Legally, he faces potential investigations and civil suits, but may avoid direct criminal liability. Politically, the damage could be severe, reframing him as a leader who sought to undermine constitutional limits. Historically, the moment would stand as a modern reaffirmation of the founders' warnings about domestic armies under presidential command. For the nation, the ruling would represent both a victory and a warning. A victory in that the judiciary and civil society can still check executive overreach, and a warning that vigilance must be constant. The health of American democracy depends not only on written laws, but on the willingness of citizens, courts, and legislators to enforce them. In the end, the question is less about Trump alone and more about the republic itself. The fate of this paramilitary project and the consequences of its illegality will help determine whether the United States remains faithful to its constitutional heritage or drifts toward a model its founders most feared.